The hum of fluorescent lights was the only constant sound in the lobby of Wexler Tower after midnight. The skyscraper was all glass and steel on the outside, but inside, when the daytime crowds thinned to nothing, it felt like a mausoleum. Ethan Keller sat at the security desk with a thermos of coffee, staring at the grainy surveillance monitors. He hated this hour, the dead time between midnight and dawn. Not because of boredom, not because of exhaustion, but because, for weeks now, the building seemed to wake up when everyone else went home. At first, he thought it was in his head. Random flickers in the lights, the kind you blamed on old wiring. Doors that seemed slightly ajar when he was certain he'd checked them earlier. Whispers over the intercom that cut off the moment he leaned closer to listen. He had mentioned it once during shift change. Greg, the morning guard, laughed and said, "You've been watching too many ghost shows, man. This place is boring as hell." The building manager was no help either. "If the lights flicker, call maintenance. Otherwise, stop wasting my time." So Ethan stopped talking about it. But he never stopped noticing. Tonight was worse. The cameras kept glitching, lines of static scrolling across the screens, erasing whole corners of the hallways. He leaned closer to one monitor, frowning. A dark shape flickered in the stairwell feed, tall and broad-shouldered. Ethan sat up straighter, grabbing the joystick to pan the camera. The lens shifted. The stairwell was empty. "Great," he muttered. "Now I'm seeing things." Still, he wrote it down in his log. He always wrote everything down: time, location, what he saw. It was the only way he could prove, if only to himself, that it was real. At 1:47 a.m., the West Wing lights began to flicker again. Ethan checked the maintenance schedule. No work orders filed. He sighed, strapped on his flashlight, and began his patrol. The building's hallways felt different at night. The echo of his boots on the marble floor bounced strangely, like the sound was swallowed before it could return. Office doors stretched in long rows, each with polished nameplates that gleamed faintly under emergency lighting. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed against him. Halfway down the hall, Ethan froze. From somewhere ahead came the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. He flicked off his flashlight. His pulse jumped in his throat. He waited, straining his ears. The footsteps stopped. Ethan swallowed hard, flicked the beam back on, and advanced cautiously. Nothing but glass walls and empty cubicles. His light swept over neat desks, silent printers, unplugged monitors. The place was a frozen photograph of office life, but wrong in some way he couldn't name. At the end of the hall, he stopped at the stairwell door. He pressed his hand to the push bar. Cold. Too cold, like the metal had been sitting outside in winter air. He shoved it open anyway. The stairwell was empty. He tilted the flashlight up the concrete flights of stairs. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending against the walls where they shouldn't have. He felt a prickle run across the back of his neck. Something about this stairwell always bothered him. The acoustics. Normally, when you opened a stairwell door, your own footsteps echoed back in layers. Tonight there was nothing. Not silence. Nothing. Like the space itself wasn't carrying sound anymore. Ethan backed out slowly, closing the door without turning his back on it. His hand trembled as he scribbled into his logbook. Stairwell. Heard footsteps. No echo. Wrong temperature. By the time he got back to the security desk, he could feel sweat at the back of his neck. He took a long drink of coffee and tried to calm his nerves. The monitors flickered again. For a split second, he swore he saw a figure standing in the lobby near the glass entrance doors. A tall silhouette, completely still. He leaned forward. The camera blinked to static, then came back. Empty lobby. Ethan swore under his breath. He scribbled it down. He didn't care if people thought he was crazy anymore. There was something in this building at night. The hours dragged. Each time he convinced himself it was just fatigue, something else happened. A voice whispered over the intercom again, a low mutter that he couldn't quite make out. He thought it said his name. Once, while walking past the vending machines, all of them clattered at once as if something had slammed into the row. At 3:12 a.m., Ethan leaned back his chair, exhausted, staring at the glow of the monitors. That was when the hum stopped. The fluorescent lights that buzzed all night went silent in an instant. Ethan sat up straight, his ears strained. No hum, no electricity, no background drone of machines. Then, without warning, every light in Wexler Tower went out. The monitors went black. The lobby plunged into pitch-dark silence. For a moment, Ethan just sat frozen. Then his hand scrambled for the flashlight. He clicked it on. Nothing. Dead. A deep, suffocating darkness pressed in on him. And in that silence, at the far end of the lobby, something exhaled. The air in Wexler Tower grew heavy, as if the blackout had sucked the oxygen from the building. Ethan's throat tightened. His flashlight refused to work, the button clicking uselessly beneath his thumb. For a moment, there was only the sound of his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Then, again, that faint exhale. Long, slow. Too close. Who's there? Ethan's voice cracked as it bounced into the dark. No answer. He pushed back from the desk, fumbling for his backup flashlight in the drawer. His fingers swept across pens, paper clips, and finally, the cold cylinder of the spare. He flicked it on. A pale beam cut through the lobby. The light revealed rows of empty chairs, the glass doors at the far end, and the polished marble floor reflecting faintly back at him. Everything looked the same, but Ethan's gut told him it wasn't. He swung the beam across the walls. For a fraction of a second, the light caught something, a shadow that didn't belong. It darted across the far wall, fast, vanishing the moment the light reached it. Ethan whipped the beam back, but the space was empty. Just smooth marble and sterile corporate artwork. His hands trembled. He forced a shaky laugh. Just my nerves. Just my eyes playing tricks. But he wrote it in his log anyway. 3:14 a.m. shadow moved independently of light source. Ethan spent the next hour pacing the halls, flashlight beam slicing across cubicles and conference rooms. He kept expecting something to leap out, but the building was still, hushed in an unnatural way. The emergency lights hadn't kicked in, which was impossible. Power failures triggered them automatically. Something didn't want this building lit. At 4:02 a.m., he returned to the monitors. The screens flickered back to life, humming faintly. His shoulders sagged in relief. Maybe the blackout was just a grid issue. Maybe his breath stopped. On one of the screens, the West Wing corridor, something moved. A shadow. Tall. Human-shaped. But there was no light source. No reason for a shadow to exist at all. Ethan leaned closer, his face nearly pressed to the glass. The figure stretched unnaturally long across the floor, sliding forward even when the hall lights were completely dark. It moved like liquid, like smoke given form. Then the feed glitched. Static. When the image returned, the corridor was empty. Ethan's pulse raced. He yanked out his phone, scrolling to the camera app. If the monitors weren't reliable, he'd capture it himself. He left the desk, phone raised, flashlight in his other hand. The West Wing corridor smelled faintly metallic, like burnt wires. His footsteps echoed this time, sharp against the floor, and somehow that was worse. At least silence didn't remind him he was alone. He reached the stairwell door, the same one from earlier. His phone trembled in his grip as he hit record. He pushed the door open. Nothing but a staircase descending into darkness. He swept the flashlight down. Shadows recoiled, shrinking along the walls. For a brief instant, Ethan could swear the shadows moved before the light touched them, pulling away as if they sensed it coming. The phone screen jittered. The recording glitched, distorting the image into lines of static. "Come on," he whispered, shaking it. The recording stuttered, froze, then cleared. That's when he heard it. A footstep, not his, from 2 flights above. Slow, measured. He tilted the flashlight upward, hand shaking. The beam stretched along the railing, up the next flight. Nothing. Empty gray concrete. Another footstep, this time behind him. Ethan spun, flashlight beam cutting across the stairwell. Empty. His phone slipped from his grip and clattered to the floor. The screen froze on static for 3 long seconds before it went black. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. He scooped up the phone, bolted out of the stairwell, and slammed the door shut. By the time dawn approached, the building's lights flickered back to life. The hum of electricity returned, buzzing through the fluorescent bulbs. To anyone walking in, Wexler Tower would look perfectly normal. But Ethan knew better. When Greg arrived for shift change, Ethan shoved the logbook into his hands. "Read it. Tell me that doesn't sound wrong." Greg skimmed the entries, chuckling at first. His grin faded when he reached the page about the stairwell. Footsteps with no echo. Independent shadows. He shook his head. "Look, man, you work nights, your brain's fried. You're just imagining I recorded it." Ethan snapped, pulling out his phone. He opened the gallery, scrolling to the file. The video was gone. Not corrupted. Not frozen. Gone. As if it had never been recorded. Greg handed back the logbook with a shrug. "Seriously, Ethan, get some sleep." Ethan's jaw clenched. He wanted to scream at Greg, shake him, make him believe. But the words died in his throat. He collapsed into the lobby chair, rubbing his face with both hands. Maybe Greg was right. Maybe fatigue was eating him alive. But as Greg walked away toward the elevators, Ethan froze. On the polished marble floor, stretching long behind Greg's moving figure, was his shadow. Normal, natural, and right beside it, just half a step off, was another shadow. One that moved with Greg's, but didn't belong to him. Ethan didn't sleep that morning. He went home, closed his blinds, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. That second shadow trailing beside Greg like a parasite. By the time night came again, exhaustion had him jittery. He clocked in for his shift, but instead of sitting at the desk, he opened the dusty filing cabinets in the security office. Old binders, safety inspection logs, renovation permits, anything that might explain why this place didn't feel right. Halfway through the stack, he found a folder with yellowed blueprints. The ink was faded, but the foundation plans were clear. Beneath Wexler Tower lay the remains of a much older building. Ethan frowned. He'd never heard about this. At midnight, when the building was silent, he searched online from the security terminal. The internet was slow, the page refreshes glitching, but finally he found it. An old newspaper article scanned into the city archives. Renovation tragedy. 2 workers dead in basement collapse, 1989. The article described how the construction crew unearthed sealed tunnels beneath the foundation, remnants of a demolished psychiatric facility. Workers claimed the tunnels were unstable. Management pressed forward anyway. The collapse killed 2 men instantly. Ethan leaned back, pulse racing. A psychiatric facility, buried under his workplace. It would explain the whispers, the shadows, maybe even the feeling of the building itself breathing during the blackout. He printed the article, folded it into his logbook, and locked the drawer. For the rest of the shift, he felt less afraid. He had proof. The next morning, he confronted his supervisor, a pinched man named Dwyer who never seemed to blink enough. Ethan slapped the article on the desk. "This building's not right," Ethan said. "You've got records of deaths, foundations over an asylum, and no one warned me when I took the job. I'm telling you, something is..." Dwyer didn't look at the paper. His eyes stayed on Ethan, cold and flat. "Mr. Keller, are you asking to be relieved from duty?" Ethan blinked. "I'm saying we need to take this seriously, then take it up with maintenance," Dwyer cut in. "Your job is to sit at a desk and call the police if someone breaks in, not to chase ghost stories." He slid the paper back across the desk without touching it. Ethan stormed out, his chest tight. Nobody wanted to hear it. Nobody wanted to believe him. When he returned for his next shift, he unlocked the drawer to check on the article. It was gone. So were the blueprints. So were his notes about the stairwell. Only the blank logbook pages remained. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty folder. Something in this building didn't just want to be unseen. It wanted to erase itself from memory. At 2:43 a.m., the monitors blinked. Every screen froze at once. The timestamp in the corner stopped moving. For a moment, it looked like the entire building had paused. Then, one by one, the cameras resumed, except for the lobby feed. On that monitor, a figure stood facing the glass doors. Ethan's stomach flipped. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and completely still. He grabbed the joystick, panning the camera. The figure didn't move. He leaned closer. The shape was darker than the lobby around it, as if the shadows themselves had thickened. And then, without the camera moving, the figure turned its head, directly toward the lens. Ethan stumbled back, knocking over his chair. The monitor glitched to static, then came back. The lobby was empty again. The next day, he called the city records office from a payphone outside. "I'm looking for information on the land where Wexler Tower stands. Old property deeds. Prior structures." The clerk on the other end hesitated. "That's unusual. Give me a minute." Papers shuffled. The clerk's voice came back, lower now. "Sir, nothing's listed before 1987. It's as if the plot was empty land." "That's impossible," Ethan snapped. "I saw the records myself." "Sir," the clerk interrupted, "whatever you think you found, it's not here anymore." The line went dead. Ethan stood frozen at the payphone, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. That night, the storm hit. Rain hammered the glass walls of Wexler Tower, wind howling around the steel frame. Ethan sat at the desk, knuckles white on his flashlight. The storm knocked the city grid unsteady. Lights flickered across the skyline outside. At 3:09 a.m., the inevitable happened. The entire block went black. Wexler Tower plunged into silence. The monitors flickered dead. Ethan raised his flashlight. This time it worked. A thin beam pierced the lobby. The glass doors rattled under the wind. Outside, the city was a void, skyscrapers erased into blackness. For once, it wasn't just his building. The whole block was dead. Then Ethan froze. Through the rain-smeared glass, something moved in the street. Not a car, not a person, a shape, blacker than the blackout itself. Crossing the road on limbs too long, shoulders bent, dragging itself into the storm. And it was moving toward Wexler Tower. The storm battered Wexler Tower with fists of rain, the glass walls groaning under the pressure. Ethan pressed the flashlight beam against the lobby glass, his heart slamming as the shape across the street vanished between the shadows. It hadn't been human. He knew that much. He didn't wait for it to arrive at the doors. He grabbed his radio and hissed into it. "Greg? Anyone? Do you copy?" Static answered. Just static, punctuated by a faint crackle, like breath on the other end. Then a whisper slid through. "Ethan." He dropped the radio like it burned him. Forcing air into his lungs, he turned toward the elevators. If power was out across the block, the source had to be the building's basement. The power room. Maintenance always warned the guards never to mess with it. But Ethan wasn't about to sit still and wait for whatever was out there to crawl inside. The flashlight's beam trembled as he crossed the empty lobby and pried open the stairwell door. The stairwell seemed deeper tonight, the concrete swallowing the sound of his steps. He descended flight after flight, the air growing damp and metallic. The smell of old copper wires and rust curled in his nostrils. At the lowest level, the basement corridor stretched out, lined with steel doors. His beam passed over faded warning signs. Authorized personnel only. Danger. High voltage. Something dripped in the distance. The sound echoed unnaturally long, as though the corridor itself didn't want silence. Ethan gripped the flashlight tighter. Halfway down, he froze. Someone was standing ahead. A man in overalls, shoulders stooped, holding a mop. The janitor. The one Ethan had seen before. The only other person who ever hinted at knowing more than he said. The janitor lifted his head. His eyes caught the beam, glinting pale. "You shouldn't be here," the man rasped. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw, like it hadn't been used in years. "The power's dead," Ethan said. His voice cracked. "Something's in this building. I saw it outside." The janitor shook his head slowly. "It doesn't like the light." "I know that," Ethan snapped. "What is it? What's happening here?" The man's gaze slid past Ethan, down the dark corridor. His lips trembled. "You won't stop it." "None of us could." Before Ethan could ask more, the janitor shuffled back into the darkness, the mop dragging along the floor with a squeal. In seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Ethan stood shaking, his breath clouding in the air. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, almost subterranean. He forced himself forward until he reached the reinforced double doors of the power control room. Heavy padlocks hung from the handles, but one was broken, the metal warped as if something had twisted it apart from the inside. His throat tightened. The door creaked open. The room inside glowed faintly with dead machinery. Towering transformers and tangled wiring lined the walls like metal veins. The flashlight beams skimmed across gauges and dials, most of them lifeless. But some of the wires were moving. Thin copper strands twitched against the floor like worms, pulsing as though they carried a current Ethan couldn't hear. They slithered toward the back wall, converging into a knot of darkness. Ethan stepped closer, stomach twisting. It wasn't darkness. Not exactly. It was a shape. A mass hunched in the far corner, bigger than a man, its edges rippling like smoke. The wires fed into it, disappearing into folds of shadow that shifted wetly. The flashlight beam quivered across its surface. For a heartbeat, Ethan saw fragments, limbs that weren't limbs, faces half-formed and dissolving, eyes that blinked and vanished. Then the entire room exhaled. The bulb of the flashlight popped. Darkness swallowed him whole. Ethan gasped, fumbling with the broken light. His ears filled with sound, whispers layering over whispers, dozens of voices chanting his name. Ethan, Ethan, the wires twitched violently now, snapping against the floor, tangling around his boots. He staggered back, wrenching free. His hands groped for the door. The voices rose in unison, a low chorus vibrating the walls. Something moved. The mass uncoiled, taller now, stretching toward him. He felt it before he saw it, the weight of presence pressing against his chest, forcing the air out of him. He stumbled into the hall, slamming the door behind him. The impact rattled the frame. For a moment, he just leaned there, gasping, heart clawing up his throat. His skin crawled with the memory of those whispers in his ear, too many voices to count. Then, the lights flicker on. The fluorescent bulbs above him buzzed back to life, flooding the basement corridor with sterile light. The hum of electricity returned. Ethan whirled around. The power room door was closed, perfectly intact. The locks weren't broken at all, as if it had never been touched. He backed up the stairwell, gripping the dead flashlight, his mind unraveling. Was he losing it? Was the building twisting reality itself? When he finally stumbled into the lobby, dawn light was bleeding across the city skyline. The storm had passed. The block was alive with normal traffic, office workers, and blinking crosswalks. Wexler Tower looked ordinary again. Ethan collapsed into the lobby chair, staring at his shaking hands. He wanted to run, quit, never come back. But something told him if he left now, it wouldn't matter. It would follow him. He scribbled one final line in his logbook, his handwriting jagged. There's something alive in the power room. He slammed the log shut, shoved it into the drawer, and shut his eyes. But behind his eyelids, he still saw it. The shifting mass, the wires feeding into it, the countless faces dissolving into shadow. And the eyes that had opened in the dark. The morning after his descent into the basement, Ethan should have quit. But he didn't. He told himself it was because he needed proof, something undeniable he could take to the outside world. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was already caught. Whatever lived in Wexler Tower had noticed him. It wasn't going to let him go. That night, he arrived for his shift hollow-eyed and trembling. The janitor wasn't around. Greg didn't show. The lobby was too quiet, as though the building had already sealed itself for what was coming. At 12:17 a.m., the first flicker came. A brief stutter in the lights. Ethan tensed, gripping his flashlight. At 12:29, the intercom crackled to life with whispers of his name. By 12:41, the hum of the building shifted, a low vibration rattling the glass walls. And at 12:59, the power failed completely. The building exhaled, and everything went dark. Ethan flicked on his flashlight, but the beam only reached a few feet before dissolving into the suffocating black. He grabbed his logbook and radio, then froze. The lobby doors had locked. He hadn't touched them, but the electronic bolts had clicked into place. He tried his keycard. The reader was dead. Trapped. The radio hissed. Ethan lifted it, his breath catching. Hello? Anyone? Static. Then, we see you, he dropped it. The whisper didn't sound human anymore. The lights flickered back for a split second, enough for Ethan to see shapes in the lobby. Not people, shadows, dozens of them, clinging to the corners, pressed flat against the glass, bending unnaturally along the marble. When the lights died again, they moved. He could hear them, the scrape of limbs too long, the hiss of breath without lungs. Ethan staggered backward, flashlight beam trembling across the floor. A shadow darted across the light's edge, vanishing before he could center it. He bolted for the stairwell, the sound of pursuit sliding along the walls. Down. He didn't know why, but his instincts pulled him downward. Maybe he thought the basement power room held the answer. Maybe it was the building itself guiding him. The stairwell groaned with each step, vibrating under his feet as if the structure itself was alive. On the third flight down, the emergency lights flickered. For half a second, Ethan saw the landing swarming with shadows. When darkness fell again, they were gone. But the air was heavier, suffocating. By the time he reached the basement, the flashlights sputtered. The power room doors stood wide open. The wires no longer twitched quietly. They writhed across the floor in coils, pulsing like veins feeding into something bigger. The air stank of ozone and rot. And in the far corner, the mass was awake. It loomed taller now, filling the room, its surface a seething ocean of shapes. Faces pressed outward, screaming silently before dissolving into the black. Limbs reached and melted away. Eyes opened, then multiplied, unblinking. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus in Ethan's head. "Join us. You already belong. We've been waiting." Ethan staggered back. "No, no." He raised a flashlight like a weapon, flicking it desperately. The bulb glowed weakly, cutting into the thing's surface. Wherever the light touched, the mass recoiled, shivering. But the bulb popped again, plunging him into pure black. The thing surged forward. Wires lashed around his arms and legs, cold and slick, pulling him toward the shadows. Ethan screamed, tearing against them, but the more he fought, the tighter they constricted. His logbook slipped from his hand, pages fluttering across the floor. He was dragged closer. Faces in the mass opened their mouths, and for a split second, he heard his own voice screaming back at him from inside them. "No." Ethan howled, his throat raw. "I won't." The building lights exploded on. For one blinding instant, the entire power room was bathed in sterile white. The mass shrieked, a sound that shook the walls. The wires snapped back, and then everything went dark for good. Silence. When the maintenance team arrived the next morning, they found the lobby empty. The logbook was on the floor behind the security desk, open to a final sentence ending mid-word. "It's here, it's..." Ethan Keller was gone. The cameras from the night before all showed the same thing. Employees frozen at their desks, janitors pausing mid-step, as though time had stopped during the blackout. But on every feed, in every corner of the building, one shadow moved freely, not attached to anyone. And on the final frame before the cameras cut to static, just as the power collapsed, every single person in Wexler Tower turned their heads toward the lens in unison. Their mouths opened, and the screen went black.